Good evening and welcome to Gwinnett County Public Library's Meet the Author series. Our author is Carol Anderson, the New York Times bestselling author of White Rage and One Person, One Vote. Her brand new book is the second, Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America. And our moderator is beloved Atlanta local Rose Scott. And Rose is the award-winning journalist and host of the program Closer Look, heard on our Atlanta NPR station. In her role as host, Rose has interviewed foreign heads of states, cabinet members, United States ambassadors, numerous consul generals, and state and local elected officials, as well as civic and social leaders. Closer Look has become a signature broadcast for the community and brings together viewpoints from all sectors of our society. We welcome Rose Scott and Carol Anderson to Gwinnett County Public Library.
Wow, well, good evening, and thank you, Denise, for that. And thank you all for taking the time to join this virtual conversation. As always, thank you to Gwinnett County Public Library. You know, just this week, I spoke with someone that Dr. Carol Anderson knows very well, a fellow historian and author, and Professor Jelani Cobb. And we were talking about the 1968 Kerner Report. And I opened up our segment by saying, does history repeat itself? Well, of course it does sometimes. And our nation seems to be in this moment that it's been in before, especially during the 60s. And that includes all these optics around gun rights. And I'm sure we'll get into the Gun Control Act of 1968. But as always, I am looking forward to being in conversation with Dr. Carol Anderson and her latest, the second, Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America. Dr. Anderson, as always, good to be with you.
Oh, it's great being with you, Rose.
You know, we've had so many conversations throughout the years, and I realized you have never sent me a bottle of wine or anything. You nothing, no flowers.
Rum.
Puerto Rican rum is good, and for the audience, don't ask. But no, it's always good to be in conversation with you. Before we get into our conversation, I want to talk about just the Second Amendment for a second, because I'm curious. What are the biggest misconceptions or misinterpretations about the Second Amendment?
I think that we've got a couple of big, heavy duty ones. One is that we've got this kind of glorified sense of the militia. That is this incredible bulwark against foreign invasion, as well as against domestic tyranny. And that this militia is like hallowed ground for that. I think the next piece of how we think about the Second Amendment is this bedrock individual right to bear arms. That is really a new invention, but it is part of a new invention that comes out of years of litigation and court cases. And again, to me, the Second Amendment seems really foundational in terms of the way it is described as protecting our freedoms, protecting our democracy. And the Second Amendment is a very different beast than that.
You mentioned in terms of how it's been this hallowed ground, it's always been the platform it's been placed on. And you mentioned just how of late, probably within maybe the 18th or the 19th, 20th century, it's been modified in terms of who it's exactly supposed to protect or what it's supposed to protect. People get that all twisted and turned around.
Yes, I mean, and it gets really twisted. And part of it has been a push to define gun rights as being foundational in a way to citizenship. But what our history really tells us is that it is a very limited definition of citizenship. It is a racialized definition of citizenship, and that it is about eviscerating the rights of large swaths of the American population.
Well, and so from there, let's talk about in this moment, Dr. Anderson, for someone like you who is a writer and also an academic, that moment for you where you said, you know what, not only am I going to write about it, the Second Amendment, but to put it in a context that might really surprise or alarm or educate some folks. In other words, as Oprah would say, and she wouldn't mind me stealing this, when was that aha moment to come up with this?
So it was when I began to do the research. So this research began with the killing of Philando Castile. And he was the Black man in Minnesota who was pulled over by the police. The police officer asked to see his ID. Philando Castile, basically mirroring what the NRA had said to let the officer know, I've got a license to carry weapon with me, so that the officer wouldn't be surprised. And the officer began shooting. And so Philando Castile is killed because he simply has a license to carry weapon, not because he's threatening anybody, not because he's pulled a gun out on anybody, he's not brandishing it, none of that. He's killed simply because he has a weapon. And the NRA went virtually silent on this. I mean, you didn't hear the NRA doing any of its bluster swag stuff that the NRA does. They just went virtually silent on this. And so journalists began asking, don't African Americans have Second Amendment rights? And I went, ooh, that's a really good question. And I started hunting and ended up back in the 17th century. And that is where I started getting my aha moment, like, ooh, oh, this thing is something real. Yeah.
Let's talk about that. Let's go back then and take our audience through some of this. When you go back, you're researching, where did you begin? Did you know where to begin? Because often people will probably say, oh, well, you had to start with the Constitution or the Bill of Rights or what have you, but you went a little bit back further than that.
Yeah, so I went back and I started looking at gun laws. You know, who has the right to bear arms? Who has the right to carry weapons? And what I started seeing in these gun laws early on were how the enslaved and free Blacks were denied access to weapons. And that with each slave revolt or anticipated slave revolt, rumored slave revolt, or that the laws became much more stringent each time. And I started seeing in the language this fear of Black people, this fear, this definition of Black people as dangerous, as inherently criminal, as a threat to white society, and that this society had to be protected from these Black people. And that is where the ownership of guns really started coming in.
So you're saying that going back into the you said 17th century,
yeah,
and looking at gun laws and looking at how they were crafted, what they were crafted out of, was at the core to keep Black Americans or Negroes or whomever, to keep them at bay, to keep them in place.
Yes, I started seeing this strong, what I call this strong foundation of anti-Blackness, where Black people's humanity was not recognized. Instead, it was being defined as property, as criminal, as a threat, as dangerous, as something that had to be controlled, and that you had to make examples of when Black people would rise up to get their freedom.
I want to read something, a passage that stood out to me, and if folks will bear with me for a moment, this really, it just hit me. Legislatures passed a series of statutes that cracked down on free people of color with an unprecedented ferocity. That in itself captures the beginning, if you will, leading up to where we are now.
An unprecedented ferocity. I mean, it was just, it was boom, 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 boom. It was, you know, no, they cannot bear arms, and they can only have arms if, you know, and it was these, they had to be around, whites had to approve Black people having arms, and it had to be under like conditions of war where they would be able to get access to guns. It was, and they were being charged so much. I mean, it just, there was so much in these laws that were about denying access to weapons because they were seen as Black people as being inherently a threat, meant then that being armed increased that threat exponentially. And so it's like, how do we keep whites safe in this society? So I've got this language, we've got to keep a ferocious monster in chains. Yeah.
I don't want to give too much away with the book, but I also want to take our audience through sort of the progression of this, because from that time, how much information, how much, I guess, research did you have that you probably couldn't put in the book as well? Was there some things left out that you couldn't?
Yes, and so yes, unfortunately there were. So what I did was I looked at the anti-Blackness and this fear of Black people, and how that was shaping not only the Constitution, the founding of the Constitution, where we get the 3/5 clause and the Atlantic slave trade expanded for 20 more years and the fugitive slave clause, but then the Second Amendment itself, because that was tied up in how the anti-federalists, particularly the Southern anti-federalists,
Mhm.
Patrick Henry and George Mason, were threatening to scuttle the Constitution if they did not get protection for the militia. George Mason's like, we will be left defenseless, because James Madison had put the control of the militia under the federal government. And it was like, oh, we can't trust those people because they got people in there from Massachusetts and Pennsylvania. And you know, the North detests slavery. And
Mhm.
so when I saw the crafting of this Second Amendment, then what I started doing was tracking for African Americans what we understand as the concept of the Second Amendment: the right to bear arms, the right to a well-regulated militia, and the right to self-defense, and tracking that through the current day. So there's stuff in there that's not there. So Tulsa isn't in the book, right?
Mhm.
But with Tulsa, you had Black men coming to the courthouse armed to try to stop a lynching. And the response to that was to have the mob deputized. And that mob then slaughtered that Black community, dropping bombs on that Black community. I don't have in there, for instance, Columbia, Tennessee, what they call the race riot in Columbia, Tennessee,
Mhm.
where a Black veteran was protecting his mother from a beating. And so in 1946, and so whites were gathering to basically lynch this Black man and to burn down the Black community, mink slide. And those Black veterans were like, son, not today. And they took up their defensive positions with their weapons. And as whites came, they started shooting. Then the guard came in, and over 20 Black men were charged with murder, and Thurgood Marshall had to defend them, and he was almost lynched in the process. So there were all of these stories that have happened that didn't end up in the book, but the book has a lot of stuff in there to make the point.
Let me ask you this, because I'm curious, between when you started, let's start with you mentioned George Mason and Patrick Henry. In between that time, and let's move up to maybe after Reconstruction, did we see any changing of legislation of gun laws as it relates to ownership, or did it remain the same?
Yeah, and what I saw was that the legal status of African Americans did not change the sense of the fear of Black people. So after the Civil War, when Black folks are no longer property,
Mhm.
and then you get the 1867 Reconstruction Act and the 14th Amendment, they become citizens. That change in legal status did not change the kind of fear about Black people. And so you had, right after the Civil War, you had the Black codes that were
Mhm.
about controlling Black people's labor and also disarming Black folks, because after the war, Black folks had guns from the war. We've got to disarm them. And you had the slaughter happening on Black people and not a lot of intervention to stop this slaughter. Annette Gordon-Reed calls it a slow motion genocide, is what we saw happening after the Civil War.
Wow. You know, we could spend hours talking about the middle to late 1960s, and especially during Lyndon Johnson's presidency, because I really want to get into this. But often is not mentioned that President Johnson signed this Gun Control Act of 1968. There are a lot of optics around it, and we know about the year of 1968. And by the way, folks, if you have a question or comment, feel free to put it in the chat and we'll get to it. I promise you we'll get to it. But Professor, I want to talk about that because the Gun Control Act of 1968 is significant And there's and we'll get to that, but I want you to go ahead and through your lens tell our attendees here the significance of that Gun Control Act of 1968.
Yeah, and I'm going to put that Gun Control Act into the larger context of the late 60s. So we have in 67 the rise of the Black Panthers, which was in response to the police violence that the Black community was facing. And that there was no amount of accountability in the system. And so the Panthers were like, we will be that accountability. We will police the police. And so they knew what the laws were about open carry. They knew what the laws were about the kinds of guns they could have, what they couldn't have, and how they were supposed to carry those guns, and the distance they were supposed to maintain from the police as they're watching the police make their arrest. The police did not like being policed. And so they ran to Don Mulford, who was a conservative assemblyman in California, and said, look, we need your help. The Panthers are a problem. Every time we pull them over, we can't arrest them because they're not doing anything illegal. We need to make them illegal. And so you get the Mulford Act, which was drafted by Don Mulford and the NRA, a representative of the NRA. And eagerly signed by Governor Ronald Reagan, about how do we bring the Black Panthers under control? How do we stop them from legally being able to police the police?
Interesting that the NRA, you mentioned the NRA being silent on the tragic death of Philandro, but interesting the NRA being silent in this moment in our history as it relates to Black Panthers, who were doing the very thing that they were proponents of.
Right. And you hear the language is the Black Panthers are a threat. They are a serious threat. And to whom are they a threat? So the issue was the violence that was raining down on the Black community by the police and the lack of accountability. You didn't see the California Assembly trying to figure out how do we provide some accountability for we're having Black folks just gunned down, Black folks beaten up.
But there were two other, obviously, 1968, the assassination of Dr. King, the assassination of Kennedy. And also now it appears, and you touch on it, it appears that now what federal and state and local folks are wondering, white folks are wondering, okay, with this, now we really have to be concerned about gun violence, but not from the folks that assassinated Dr. King and Mr. Kennedy, but from from Black folks and from folks who were their supporters and who looked up to these folks. In other words, Democrats in a sense too.
Right. And so part of what you had happening is, as you recall, there were these uprisings. There was the uprising in Watts in 65. There was the uprising in Newark,
Detroit.
In Detroit. I mean, and it's like boom, boom. And there was this fear. It was, again, this fear of Black people. Look at Black people. Look at them. They're so criminal. It's the pathology of Blackness that was coursing through in the policy sphere, in the media sphere. And in order to explain what they were seeing, it was, look at those violent, dangerous, criminal Black people. How do we bring them under control? And so the Gun Control Act of 1968, one of its key elements, and so it dealt with guns that were going interstate, but it really dealt with banning Saturday night specials, which were the cheap guns that were available for poor people. And so you saw them disproportionately used in the inner city.
And also too, there's another aspect of the gun from 68 is that convicted felons now would not be allowed to have a firearm. Now we've seen some changes in that in terms of you met some type of probation, but from that origin, it was if you were a convicted felon, you were not going to own a firearm.
Right. I mean, and remember, and this is also at the time, and this part of what we don't really recognize is that the rise of the criminal justice system, this rise of mass incarceration started. There's a wonderful scholar named Naomi Murakawa who has a book called The First Civil Right. And she pegs it happening in the 1940s, where we start getting this rise of this language of Black criminality and the creation of this criminal justice system. And so this is happening at the time where you're getting, and felons cannot own guns, when you're criminalizing Blackness. And that is a long, long history. The Negro Act of 1740 in South Carolina says that Blacks are inherently criminal and that they must be controlled by whites. So when you have that language in 1740 and you see it coming through in the laws in the 20th century, it begins to tell you how embedded this vision of anti-Blackness is in the system.
I want to shift for a moment, and I want to talk about the NRA, because of course now they've got a whole lot of other issues going on, but I want to shift back to its origin and the role they play in all of this as well, because right now we know the NRA has a lot of members who are people of color, but what history tells us about the what's rooted in the NRA, and I want you to let our audience know what that's all about.
So the NRA actually began in 1871 as an organization founded by Union soldiers who were concerned about the lack of marksmanship that they saw during the Civil War. And so they were like, okay, so we're going to teach you how to shoot. And so that organization really began under that framework. But you began to see it get much more politicized in the 60s with the rise of the civil rights movement and this language about Black folks no longer being under the control. And then they had what was called the coup of 1977, where the right wing took over the NRA in Cincinnati and became highly politicized. And this is where you begin to see like the rise of the NRA championing the breakout in Waco and the gun battle in Ruby Ridge, where they called federal officers who were trying to serve warrants, they called them federal, they called them jackbooted government thugs. So, so the NRA was also really engaged, as I said, in this kind of hyping politicians who were about gun rights and, individual gun ownership. But they define that individual gun ownership and that individual gun rights in ways that, as they tied it to a political party that was moving further and further to the right, it really tied it to whiteness in a way that just, whew.
Let me ask you this: is it? And I think Frontline might have even used this narrative. Is it fair to say, or accurate to say, that look, conservatives sort of reinvented the Second Amendment?
What you saw them doing with that Second Amendment was, even in their motto on their building, they got rid of the first part of the Second Amendment that said the right to a well-regulated militia for the safety, for the security of a free state. They got rid of that and really highlighted this individual's right to bear arms shall not be infringed. And so, and this working of the Second Amendment in a way that defines it as this individual right to bear arms, because you've got to look out for all of this government tyranny. And we see it legally when we get to the Heller decision and when we get to the McDonald decision, where the Supreme Court ruled that there was an inherent right to self-defense and therefore an inherent right for an individual right to bear arms.
I want to get your thoughts on something. This is a big shift here, but it deals with the fact that some of these gun manufacturers are settling, and I believe in as a journalist, it's my job to deal in facts, but even with some of the recent Sandy Hook murders, to settle with some of the families in terms of being, or accountability, or maybe they didn't admit to it, but settling with families who's lost loved ones, and we know a lot of kids who lost loved ones in Sandy Hook. What do you make of that? That gun manufacturers, and I'm just curious, I know it has maybe nothing to do with the book, but I'm just curious because, I'm a journalist. I'm always asking questions that probably people don't want to, but
I think that they had worked really hard to get immunity from having to be responsible for flooding the nation with guns. If we understand that the NRA is actually a gun manufacturer's lobby, that's, so it is about how do we get more guns sold? And part of that was to provide immunity, legal immunity for gun manufacturers. So one of the things that I find fascinating is that the NAACP sued the gun manufacturers for flooding the Black community with weapons and therefore heightening the homicide rate in the Black community. And that case was thrown out. But you had this sense that these gun manufacturers are liable, have to take responsibility for just the inordinate number of guns in this society. And so part of what I'm arguing in this book is that we have to rethink what safety and security really looks like.
That's a great point, because my next question deals with getting your thoughts on sort of this narrative that having the argument for people to have guns and all these gun rights mean that we can be safer. But that's not exactly, and there's no data that supports that.
There is no data that supports that. I mean, the data are clear that folks who have guns in the home are more likely to be shot with their own weapons. That where you have stand your ground laws, that in fact you have a higher level of homicides happening in those states that have stand your ground laws. And that there is a racial disparity in stand your ground laws.
Well, and here in Georgia, the General Assembly just got rid of that. Now there is a pending case, which we all know as relates to Ahmaud Arbery, because the men charged with his murder, they're using the stand your ground. They couldn't use it now if it happened because the law has been passed, but they're using your stand your ground. We saw this also with Trayvon Martin down in Florida and George Zimmerman. I want to talk about process for a moment, Professor Anderson, in putting together a book like this, because as a historian, and I know you're going to operate in truth and you're going to come up with facts, but for a subject like this, how much time did it take you to gather all this?
I had a team of incredible research assistants. It took years. Going through it, reading through it, thinking through it, verifying it, making sure that what I had was accurate, because I was also really well aware of how politicized this field is. And that, so when I got a source, I was looking for who wrote it, what's their background, who funded it. So I was getting the perspective of what this source was bringing.
Was there a topic, or I guess a narrative, that you wanted to get more information on, wanted to get more research on, but you couldn't get enough or didn't feel comfortable putting it in the book? And I know sometimes authors don't want to admit that, but
I can't say that there was. As I said, there were these stories that I had to leave out simply because of the time crunch of wanting to get this book out, but the basic overarching narrative going from the 1600s to the 21st century and Kyle Rittenhouse.
That's the young man up in Wisconsin who killed two protesters. And if folks don't know the story, I mean, he's walking past the police with his rifle. He's not old enough to own one. His mother drove him to the protest.
Right. And with that Kyle Rittenhouse story, what I do is I look at the ways, when I'm talking about anti-Blackness, I juxtapose Kyle Rittenhouse to Tamir Rice. And so you've got Kyle Rittenhouse, who has an illegally obtained AR-15, crosses state lines to go to Kenosha, Wisconsin, because there's a protest because a Black man, Jacob Blake, has been shot in the back 7 times by police in front of his children. And in this protest, when when Kyle Rittenhouse shows up with this AR-15, the police welcome him. They're like, oh, we really appreciate you guys being here. You want some water? You know, it's hot out here. So they don't see this young man, this teenager, as a threat carrying this AR-15. He goes and he shoots 3 people, killing 2, seriously wounding a 3rd. He walks back towards the police with his hands up as if to surrender, and they go right by him. They don't, it doesn't even register. And juxtapose that to Tamir Rice, who's in Ohio, an open carry state that says you can openly carry a weapon as long as you're not threatening anybody. He's playing in the park by himself with a toy gun. And granted, it doesn't have the orange tip on there that says, hey, I'm a toy.
Sure.
He's by himself. So the open carry laws should obtain. Instead, the police roll up and within 2 seconds, they gun him down. And they say he was threatening, he was dangerous. We were fearful for our lives. And so not fearful for your lives with a guy carrying an AR-15, but fearful for your, in a crowd where there's all these people milling about protesting, but fearful when a 12-year-old is playing in the park by himself. I mean, so that's the difference in the ways that anti-Blackness works through this system.
I want to also now talk about the Supreme Court and all of this, because now you look at the makeup of the Supreme Court, which is super majority and conservative. And you mentioned Heller. How do you see more challenges to some gun laws, even if it makes it to the Supreme Court? What do you see happening there? And are there some legislation that you're looking at throughout the nation that could possibly make it to the Supreme Court?
Well, in fact, there's a case that's going up to the Supreme Court now coming out of New York, because New York has a law dealing with the ability to carry a concealed weapon. And there's a whole series of things you have to go through. And there is a challenge to that law, basically from the folks who are the gun rights folks. But you also have a team of public defenders who have poor Black folks as their clients, who are being just rousted because they have a felony conviction, and so they're not supposed to have guns, or that they have this gun but they don't have the permit, and it gives the police the ability to ratchet that up from a misdemeanor to a felony. And so that group is weighing in on an amicus curiae brief. I say that we have got to really think through this. Guns do not make us safe. And part of that narrative that has happened here in America is that I'm going to get my gun and I'm going to be safe. That's not what happens. We have traded our safety and our security for anti-Blackness. And let me be clear what I mean by that.
Yeah.
So that when you hear the language of, if you take my gun, I'm going to be left defenseless. I think of Jonathan Metzl's book, Dying of Whiteness, where he set up a study in Missouri with white families who had suffered gun violence. And as they were meeting, he asked them, about gun safety laws. And they're like, oh no, nobody's going to come and take my gun, because then we're going to be left defenseless, because those folks from St. Louis are going to come down here and try to take everything that we have. We're going to be left defenseless. And that reminded me of George Mason at the Constitutional Ratification Convention in Virginia in 1788, talking about we will be left defenseless. That fear of Black people and being left defenseless means then that we're willing to trade that to say, I'm going to have my gun, but I'm willing to be unsafe in the grocery store. I'm willing to be unsafe in a movie theater. I'm willing to be unsafe when I'm driving my car. I'm willing to be unsafe in a stadium. I'm willing to be unsafe at work. All of these places where we're willing to trade safety because of the fear of being left defenseless against this Black horde coming in from the cities to take everything that we have.
By the way, folks, you can put in the chat if you want to a question or comment for Dr. Carol Anderson. I know some folks joined us late, and we are talking about her latest book, The Second, Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America. Let's talk about what this book is not for a moment, because you're not taking a stance in terms of whether or not it's pro-gun or anti-gun. That's not what this book is about.
Mm-mm. It really isn't. This book is about Black people's rights and what I call the fractured citizenship of African Americans. And so that's why I said this isn't a pro-gun or anti-gun book. And so you will see that there are times when I'm telling these stories. So when I'm telling the story, for instance, of Christiana in 1851 in Pennsylvania, where Black folks were battling back against slave catchers who were coming up trying to steal people back because it was my property. And Black folks said, not today. And they fought back. This isn't a pro-gun or an anti-gun book. This is about Black people's rights, their humanity, their citizenship rights, and how the Second Amendment, sitting in the Second Amendment, because what the role of the militia was designed to do was to put down slave revolts. That is what George Mason and Patrick Henry were really clear about. They're like, and you will not have a United States of America unless we get that kind of protection. And so sitting in the Bill of Rights, when you think about it, we've got the right to free speech, the right to a free press, the right not to be illegally searched and seized, the right to a speedy and fair trial, the right not to have cruel and unusual punishment. And then you get the right to a well-regulated militia for the security of a free state. I mean, it is such an outlier. It is the bribe that was paid to the Southerners to sign on to the Constitution, to not scuttle the Constitution so that the United States of America could be.
Dr. Anderson, you and I and everyone else knows that when it comes to a big election year, and goodness, we just had one. There are always some givens, right? There's always givens as it relates to, maybe workforce development and maybe, immigration and foreign affairs, foreign policy. And then you can always guarantee the question that every candidate has to grapple with and make a stance on. And that is not necessarily the Second Amendment, but gun legislation, gun rights. I want to get your thoughts on what we saw this past presidential election, and then where do you think we're going to go in 2022? Because we know it's, and I want to say this because of what came out today with the census information. Some people are going to read into that. Oh, where it said the minority population is decreasing a little bit and more of a diverse Black and brown people increasing. Sadly, some people will read that and think that they need to arm it up. Let's just be really clear about that. They will. So let's start with, you look at gun rights, the Second Amendment, and what we saw play out throughout this last presidential election, and then where you see it in 2022.
What I see is that we're getting hyped up on I've got to have my gun. I've got to have my gun. And treating that I got to have my gun as my safety, my security. And you get this kind of, of course, this politicization of it. So part of what we're not taking into account is that, so when we see gun control laws, so many times our gun control laws have been aimed at disarming Black people. And so to talk about gun rights and gun control is a conversation that gets us nowhere. It gets us nowhere. It keeps us.
But it resonates with people. It resonates with voters so well. And particularly, you could argue that with a particular demographic and particular regions of the nation, it resonates with folks.
Right. I mean, it resonates. I mean, so again, I go back to Jonathan Metzl's Dying of Whiteness, where you had folks who had family members who have died via gun violence. And they're like, no, we don't want any gun safety laws because that means that we will be left defenseless because those folks from St. Louis will come down here and try to take our stuff. We will be left defenseless. So that's where it resonates in terms of the sense of being left defenseless.
You see this playing out in 2022 as well.
Oh yeah, and particularly because there has been such a media hype on crime. I mean, if you go through the feed, you know, what you see is coronavirus and who got shot, coronavirus and who got shot. I mean, that's the feed. And the more you, and I liken it to in the 1990s, there was all of this hype. They did a study. There was all of this hype about all of this crime. And you had politicians talking about being tough on crime, except the actual crime figures, violent crime figures were going down. They had plummeted dramatically. But the hype of it, if it bleeds, it leads. And so the hype of it helps create this sense of being left defenseless. And then you put on it the numbers that were coming through in the census today. You link the historical, the long history of anti-Blackness and the definition of Black people as inherently criminal and violent. Yeah.
You've touched on anti-Blackness for throughout it, because that is at the core of this. When someone says to you, well, Professor Anderson, when you talk about this anti-Blackness and then the Second Amendment and the correlation there, someone may say, well, what about other populations? You know, we just had, sadly, tragically, obviously, here in the Atlanta area, you know, the killing of Asian Americans, you know, and particularly women and violence. Are you going to touch on other populations, other demographics as it relates to Second Amendment and gun rights as well?
You know, I've focused this book on African Americans,
Sure.
because of the role that slavery played. There is a wonderful book by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz called Loaded that looks at the Second Amendment and Native Americans.
Wow.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Right. So that is part of this story as well. It is the fear of the other that is so bedrock essential to the Second Amendment.
The fear of the other. That's a great title for a book as well. I'm gonna go back to process for a moment as an author. When you are done, I love asking authors this. Do you go back? Do you critique it? When it's done, it's done. You give it to your editor. Do you go back and say, well, let me just give it one more? Or
always. When I reread it, I'm always like, oh, you could have done that sentence better. You know, and as I'm reading, I'll find another source. I'm like, oh, I wish I could have added that sentence in here to clarify this better. So always.
There's a question here from someone that wants to know, they say, Dr. Anderson, you have published 2 great books in a short time period, which is very true. Can you tell us what the next topic will be of your next book? We already want another book, Dr. Anderson.
Okay. So I was talking with someone today. My second book, Bourgeois Radicals, I published in 2014. White Rage, I published in 2016 with an updated version in 2017. Yeah. One Person, No Vote, published in 2018 with an updated version after the 2018 election in 2019. And now the second in 2021.
You are a professor, so let's be really clear about all of this too. In terms of your process and in terms of feedback too, what have you been hearing from people about the book? I'm curious.
So what I've been hearing is like, wow, this is reshaping and reframing how I think about the Second Amendment. This is really good. And you know, and I've had folks who have asked the question, well, you know, one of the major arguments is that they were concerned about a standing army. And you did mention that. I'm like, yes, I did mention that this fear about a strong central government, the fear of the standing army, that's in there. But anti-Blackness is so prominent and dominant. It is the thing that keeps coming out. It is driving also the fear of a strong central government, because they're like, we've got to have states' rights in order to protect slavery. We cannot trust those folks in Pennsylvania and Massachusetts to care about slavery the way we care about slavery.
And so when you mirror, even going back to that time period to now in 2021, there are still some of those same, I love to use this word, same optics around gun, not gun rights, gun ownership.
Yeah, yes, I mean,
Big difference.
Yes, and so you do get this same kind of sense of who has the right to bear arms. And so this is also, like I said, part of what I'm tracking. And I use the example, for instance, in Ohio, which is an open carry state. We have John Crawford, who is in Walmart, and he picks up a BB gun off of the shelf in Walmart in an open carry state. And there's a couple behind him that call in to the police. We've got a Black man threatening kids. He's just waving his gun around.
Yeah.
It didn't happen. Happen. But John,
well, and there's the surveillance that clearly shows that.
Right. And John Crawford is shot down. And the officer says, we were afraid. I thought about him with that weapon, and I thought of my partner. My partner's life was in danger. My life was in danger. And all of the customers in Walmart were in danger.
Yeah, and that's tough to watch too, because we're in this day and age of where not only with cell phone video footage, but other footage. I want to before we say goodbye, I can't believe we're almost out of time, but I want to look at this Ahmaud Arbery case for a second right here in Georgia. And as I mentioned, the 3 men who were charged with his murder are using the stand your ground. If I want to ask you, Dr. Nelson, have you seen all of that footage as it relates to Ahmaud Arbery?
I did. I saw where they had, what they had said had happened. That they were like, hey, can you stop and talk to us for a minute? And that he didn't do that. And then I saw the video footage where they were in fact basically stalking him, and that
there is interesting footage, and I can send it to you. And I encourage everyone else who's on this Zoom, this community conversation to check it out. It's out there. The conversation with the officers as it relates to talking to the men, basically saying, well, you had no choice, right? You almost sort of coaching and before any investigation, painting the picture.
Because
these are officers.
Because the automatic assumption of Black criminality, and I mean, and that's what was playing out here. And so even when they had the videotape, remember that the DA's office said, no crime here. When they had the videotape that just totally went against it, it contradicted their narrative of what had happened. And they said, no crime here. And so the second DA then looks and says, no crime here, but writes a multi-page piece about why no crime here, even though he's got the video. Because the inherent assumption of Black criminality is so foundational that it's like, well, of course you had no choice.
Let me ask you this. Is the second, can that be used and forgive me, as part of some critical race theory?
Did you go there?
Why not?
Well, and I think that
it's an examination of history, and it's an examination of systemic racism and how it relates to current and modern day, whatever you want to call it, situations. I'll let you take it from there.
Right. So this is a study. Yes, it can be used that way because critical race theory is a theory used in law schools to examine the ways that laws help create and define race, and then create the structural barriers to equality and equity in the United States. And so when you look at the Second Amendment, we've got an amendment sitting in our Bill of Rights that is about how do we deny Black people their rights.
When we started this conversation and I asked you about some of the biggest misperceptions or misinterpretations of this, what did you learn about the Second Amendment that maybe you didn't know as you were doing this research?
I didn't know the role of anti-Blackness in the creation of the Second Amendment. I did not know that. I did not know how deeply the Southern folks, particularly those in Virginia, were battling to have a militia because they were like, we have got to protect ourselves. We will be left defenseless. The role of slavery in the Second Amendment and the role and that how we have crafted it in our current narrative has been under these legal frameworks of, is this about the right to a well-regulated militia, or is this the right about the individual's right to bear arms? And that's not the question. The question deals with anti-Blackness and the systemic denial of Black people's citizenship rights, the denial of Black people's humanity, the understanding of Black people as being inherently, fundamentally criminal and violent and dangerous, and that the white society needs to be protected against Black people. I mean, that narrative coming out of the 1600s, we still see it today. It is so powerful. That's what I learned about when I was doing this work on the Second Amendment.
Who should read this book?
Oh, I want everyone to read this book, to really engage, to think through our history, how we got here, and what are the implications and what have been the results of the choices we have made, fundamentally based on anti-Blackness. So like I said, when why after Sandy Hook, Lord, after Sandy Hook, we couldn't get any kind of depth of legislation dealing with that. And because you kept hearing, I don't want to be left defenseless. You're going to take my guns from me. The role of anti-Blackness in helping to continue to create a society where we are not safe, where we are not secure. There are consequences to that. So I want everybody to read this book, to really engage and think through it.
And you will let us know when the next book is out, because based on the question, folks are ready for another one. The book is called The Second, Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America. It's by Dr. Carol Anderson. It's a great read. I encourage everyone to read it. And again, it's not about, pro this or anti this. It's I don't say it a lot because people get mad. You're not supposed to endorse a book. Well, I'm going to endorse a book. It's a really good book. Okay. Dr. Carol Anderson, thank you so much for the conversation in the space today to have this conversation.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Thank you to our guests this evening. And yes, Ms. Carol, we are waiting for that next book with bated breath. And we hope that you'll come back and do another talk for Gwinnett County Public Library, because this was incredibly enlightening, and particularly the talk about how fear-based so many things are when we really take a look at them and examine what drives them. And that, that's an important lesson for all of us. Anyway, we thank Rose Scott for taking the time to come and be with us tonight in her incredibly busy schedule. And we hate taking Carol away from the writing of her next book, but we're grateful. And for those of you who would like to meet them both in person, I want to help by giving a little plug for their performance or their talk on stage on October 2nd, a Saturday, as part of the AJC Decatur Book Festival. And I'm looking forward to seeing them both there that day. So fans, please show up. And I hope that you all have a lovely evening. And thank you both again.
And you should note that the fact that I'm going to miss college football and spend some time with Dr. Anderson again, that says a lot, because I'm a big college football fan. So, there you have it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.